To my far right is Senator David Givens, who is President Pro Tem in the Senate, and in 2015 served on the Interim Joint Committee on Post-Secondary Education. Senator Givens is a two-time graduate of Western Kentucky, where he obtained both his bachelor's and master's degree, and he has served in the Senate since 2009. I got to Kentucky in 2009, so we've been having the great privilege of working together during that time. Next to David is Representative Ryan Quarles. Ryan represents House District 62, which includes parts of Fayette, Owen, and Scott counties. He served as the student member on the council from 2005 to 2008, so he knows our work probably as well as anybody in the legislature. He completed 3 undergraduate degrees, 2 graduate degrees, and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Kentucky. He just loves education.
And lots of student loan debt.
And he also managed to receive a master's degree in higher education from a place called Harvard. He has served in the House since 2011, and as I understand it, is running for some statewide office now, Commissioner of Agriculture. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. Next to Ryan is Senator Gerald Neal. Gerald is the Minority Caucus Chair in the Senate, and in 2015 served on the Interim Joint Committee on Post-Secondary Education, as well as the Budget Review Subcommittee on Post-Secondary Education. Senator Neal obtained his bachelor's degree from Kentucky State and his Juris Doctorate from the University of Louisville. He has served in the Senate since 1989 and has been a great friend of higher education, and we're delighted that you could join us. And finally on this panel, before I introduce the moderator, is Representative and former Speaker Jody Richards, who is now Speaker Pro Tem, and in 2015 served on the Interim Joint Committee on Post-Secondary Education, the Budget Review Subcommittee on Post-Secondary Education. Jody is a graduate of Kentucky Wesleyan College and earned a master's degree from the University of Missouri. He's also served on the faculty at Western Kentucky University, is a great supporter of their work and ours, and has been serving in the House since 1976. He is a great friend of higher education, and we are equally delighted to have you with us. Finally, moderating this panel is Al Cross, who many of you may recognize as the former chief political writer at the Courier-Journal. Currently, Al is the director of the University of Kentucky's Institute for Rural Journalism and Community Issues, and is it an associate or assistant professor? Associate professor in the University of Kentucky School of Journalism and Telecommunications. He's a longtime panelist on KET's Comment on Kentucky, and has been a contributor to several books on Kentucky and politics. A native of Albany, Kentucky. I didn't know there was one. I used to live in Albany, New York.
Albany, you know.
Yeah, right. And is a graduate of Western Kentucky University. Please join me in welcoming Al and our panelists to start this last session. Go for it.
Thank you very much, Bob. I'm very glad to be here with this august group. I think I know everyone on the panel fairly well. I know a lot of you in the audience. We're going to have a fairly informal presentation this afternoon. Senator Neal asked how formal would we be, and I said not very. On each question, I do want to give everybody a crack at it, but if one of you has something else you want to add, just raise your finger, and I'll try to call on you. We do have quite a bit of ground to cover, so I'm going to jump right into it with what I think is the most topical issue right now involving university boards, and that is the governor's failure to follow the law when it comes to the political makeup and racial representation on the university boards, most particularly the board at the University of Louisville. So the law makes unclear just what you do when the governor doesn't follow the law. And my question would be, and I'll just start with Senator Givens at the far end and come this way, should this law be made clearer and have penalties or sanctions when the governor does not follow it.
Al, thank you. And let me first say what a pleasure and honor it is to be here, and to also say to each of you that serve in a trustee capacity, thank you for doing what you do. I'm sure sometimes the burden and challenge when you weigh it against the rewards is somewhat questionable, but we've got to have great leadership at great institutions, and I'm so appreciative of all of you that largely volunteer your time to do this. In response to your question, Al, I think Senate President Stivers has written a very clear letter to Attorney General Conway asking that he investigate the matter. I think the law, in my opinion, is quite clear on what the balance needs to be. And interestingly enough, it's my understanding, and Al, you're a better historian than I, but it's my understanding that at the end of the Fletcher administration, there was a similar lawsuit going through the court system that was initiated by then Attorney General Stumbo.
That's true.
And that was concluded by who? It was concluded by Attorney General Conway.
And essentially, the governor agreed to fix things, just as Conway says he's going to fix things if he gets elected. It seems to me, though, that one of the problems in this law is there's no accounting for the 7 to 8% of Kentuckians who are registered as independents. You know, when you start saying let's have a political balance, it mentions the two major parties, but it ignores the independents. And there's no clear process laid out for invalidating these appointments should the governor not follow the law. That's really my question. Should this law be made stronger?
You can certainly make a law stronger, and I'm not opposed to taking a look at making it stronger, but in my opinion, a 0 is a pretty clear number.
Well, that boils down to the question of whether or not Hispanics are a racial minority, and I think most experts would say they are not. As you all may know, the governor left off the only black member of the U of L board and essentially replaced him with a Hispanic, which by my reckoning does not meet the requirement.
And now I think the other concern is the correlation between donors and appointments. I think that's the other concern.
Representative Quarles?
Well, no one can fault you for starting the conversation off. But, I served on CPE for a couple terms, and that's when I first got familiar with this law about apportionment, both on political, demographics, and I believe geographic in some areas. I think that's fair. And I think that all we're asking for here is that if the law is applied one way and under a certain administration, it should be applied the same way under another administration. And you all have the pleasure, I believe, tomorrow to have your gubernatorial candidates here. That'd be a good question to ask, because I think that they're the ones more than likely are going to have to rectify this situation. But you all serve in a fiduciary capacity. I think that when you have people from a different and a diverse background, you're going to come up with better solutions as you serve out your terms.
Now, I got to ask the question again. Do you think the law needs to be made tougher, and particular to say that Hispanics are not a racial minority?
Well, I think there certainly needs to be some clarification. But, I got the opportunity to serve on a diversity committee while on CPE, and I think if we're going to go down the route of how to define racial minorities, we need to be consistent.
Maybe say ethnic minorities as well as racial.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Senator Neal?
Well, since I was the author of the law, Al.
You probably think I should have called on you first, but I'm trying to remember the order, so I started at the far
actually,
end.
if you did, I would have thought something else. Let me just say this, that I think the law is clear. It needs to be enforced. I'm sure that Attorney General Conway will have a ruling that's consistent with it, because I think he'll do his job as he always has. And I think that it can be stronger. It can be made more clear. The two issues, though, if I understand the issue correctly, I think it's not whether there's a Hispanic on the board. It's that when you count all of that, it's still short when you start talking about what the law says, and it has to be as near as possible to the number.
Right.
And I think the number falls short of that, and therefore I think this is my interpretation, and it's subject to my intention when it was put in place. But you know what concerns me more? What concerns me more is that when we have laws like that, what we have a tendency to do is treat it as a ceiling as well as a floor. So we began to think in terms of not the quality of the individuals that we're appointing to these positions, but if they happen to be or fit a category such as African American, let's say, well, we got our African American on the board, and therefore, you know, we can stop right there. We've met our responsibility. That gives me much more concern than the fact that a governor or someone else interprets it differently or makes a decision that I may disagree with, because that can be rectified in the political process, or should I say in the legal process. But that issue that I just raised goes a much more deeper, and it's much more fundamental. And I raised that question. Do we have the mindset to understand when we look for quality for people on these boards, we're not looking for the ceiling. What we're really doing is we are taking and seizing the opportunity for quality for participation on these boards. And that's a challenge to appointing authorities and all of us that are interested in this instance in what happens in post-secondary education. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker?
Well, thank you very much, Al. I'm glad to be here today, and want to thank you for what you do to support and help govern our universities. I think we have a tremendous university system in Kentucky, and I think we've terribly underfunded you folks over the last 10 years, but hopefully we can rectify that to some extent next year. As far as the issues, this had its genesis, if I remember correctly, in the 1997 higher ed reform, when we did made some changes to try to depoliticize the system as much as we could by establishing the committees that.
Well, that was in 92. The nominating commissions were 92, and then the other reforms were 97.
All right, that was.
Senator Neal, when was your bill passed? Do you remember?
You weren't even in the session.
You said I was in here in '89, right? I'm not going to give you a date. It was early on, though.
Anyway, we in '97 we made quite a few changes, and if it was '92 or '97, whenever it was to try to depoliticize the system, because we felt that the governor was using these as to help him in his situation. So we tried to depoliticize it the best we possibly could. And I think the first thing is that these nominating boards need to be as non-political as possible. And secondly, I think that all governors should obey the law in terms of the number of Democrats and Republicans that they place on there. Now, in 92 or 97, there weren't that many independents in Kentucky. So I guess we couldn't anticipate that. So whether that needs to be as a part of the new equation, I don't know. But I would like to look at the law and strengthen it so that, and I don't know what sort of restrictions or requirements or sanctions would have to be done, but I'm in favor of trying to get the governors to obey the law.
I suppose one remedy might be to say that any citizen could file a suit seeking a writ of mandamus, ordering the governor to obey the law and preventing any further appointments until the law was followed. Anybody favor that?
I think we need to review the law, the implications of what any adjustments are made, and I'm not sure it's responsible just to have a pop response to what may appear to be a good resolution.
All right. We will have a question and answer period at the end of the session, so if you have a question on this, hold it, and we'll be happy to address it later on. I'm going to do one other board-oriented thing, and I am going to go back to Senator Givens again on this because it does relate to his service in the Senate. Representative Derek Graham passed a bill through the House requiring 6 hours of education for university board members and CPE members. And that bill didn't get anywhere in the Senate. And my understanding is that the leadership, of which you're a member, had some issues with that, and I wondered what those issues might have been, and if not, why the bill didn't get anywhere in the Senate.
Al, let me respond by saying I have great respect for Representative Graham and his leadership of the Senate of the House Education Committee. I have to be honest in saying I don't recall that bill coming up in a substantive leadership conversation. I can't exactly recall that there were significant obstacles.
Well, you know,
to
leadership
it.
does get blamed for things sometimes.
Leadership tends to get blamed for things sometimes, but that one does not stand out as something that we felt adamantly opposed to.
So it would have a shot next time around, you think?
I would certainly think every start of every session is a new day.
Okay. I think everybody else.
Excellent.
That's true.
I have the roll call on that bill. Let's see if Representative Quarles remembers how he voted on that. No, I can safely say that every other person here did vote for the bill. So we'll move on to the next question. And this
I
one
will
will
point
be.
out I'm the only member not in leadership here, and
That's right.
And I would like to say that that's a point. You know, for the vast majority of members in the General Assembly, they're not in leadership, and a lot of the decisions that are made in session are made during the last 2 weeks of session. And for those of us who are rank and file members, a lot of times there are take it or leave it opportunities when bills come up on the floor, and sometimes not enough time to even read the bills. And that's a procedural issue
Right.
in the General Assembly that sometimes affects voting outcomes.
Yeah, this one passed on February 12th. It got actually most of the Republicans in the House for it. I'm going to move on to something that is of broader interest, I think, to the taxpayers. And I'm going to ask the first question of Senator Neal because he had an amendment on this, even though it was Senator Gibbons' resolution. The resolution was Senate Joint Resolution 106, directing the council to come up with a performance-based and outcomes-based system for funding of public higher education in the state. And we'll get to Senator Gibbons, but I wanted to, well, actually, I think to be fair, I ought to go back to Senator Gibbons first and see if he still has the same position on this issue that you did when that bill passed, or if you're going to come back with a slightly amended version, or just where you are on this bill at this point.
Now, the conversation relates to performance-based funding. And for those of you that are not in the room and may not have been paying attention in the session when we had this discussion, for a number of years, actually for 2 budget cycles now, the conversation has been that CPE was going to be bringing to us a performance-based sort of funding model. And for lots and lots of reasons, that had not happened. And I was anxious because I felt this was such a vital conversation for our taxpayers to hear and for our universities to understand. I was anxious that we have this discussion initially in a non-budget session. So with the assistance of Ben Boggs, one of the skilled LRC staffers who's in the back of the room, I drafted what's called a Senate Concurrent Resolution, Senate SCR 106, to begin the debate and discussion about this topic of performance-based funding. When you look around the nation, we have approximately 28 to 30 states that have some element of performance-based funding. In addition to those 30 that have it, about half of those use some portion or all of their base funding flowing through this performance model. So it's not unheard of. This is not brand new. This is something a lot of other states have either implemented or are looking to implement. Basically, the conversation as I proposed it was that CPE before the next budget, which would be the budget that we discussed in 2016, CPE would bring to the General Assembly a performance-based funding recommendation. It would be for all new monies, not for monies that are in the base, and it would be built around metrics that you're familiar with, metrics like graduation rates, degree and credit hour productivity, workforce development, postgraduation earnings, while maintaining affordability for Kentucky students. And it launched us on a great debate and discussion, probably one of the best discussions we had in the entire session on the Senate floor was around this piece of legislation. There are differing views about the way this impacts different institutions. But it's vital that we send the right message through metrics. And it springs back actually to a conversation. I'm not going to single him or her out. But one of you in this room about 6 years ago in a passing conversation said to me, Senator Givens, you've got to understand that if you're constantly predicating everything we do based on enrollment, we're going to keep drawing the students in. And they're going to keep paying the tuition. And he subtly was saying, I can improve my graduation numbers if the incentive is there for me to graduate students. But when you keep telling me that enrollment is what I've got to do, whether you say it blatantly or you say it subtly, by lowering state appropriations and making us raise up tuition costs, and then we need a higher multiplier times that tuition number, he said, we're going to get there. I'd love for us to be sending the message that graduation is what matters, not the number of students you have incurring debt. That was the genesis for a lot of this discussion.
And are you still at the same place?
Very much so, and I'm hopeful from what I've heard, I'm hopeful that CPE is going to be bringing it to us without the mandate of a resolution.
Yeah, just to explain, the bill passed the Senate on essentially a party line vote. I think 2 Republicans voted against it. Senator Neal offered an amendment, of which I would like him to explain. That amendment was defeated. Explain that amendment and your position on that issue, Senator.
Well, first, let me explain why it was defeated.
Yes.
You referred to me. I'm in the minority, so to speak, in the Senate, and the majority is going to dictate the agenda and how that's going to unfold. I do agree, however, with Senator Givens that we did have a spirited discussion on the floor regarding this performance-based funding model as such. And quite frankly, the reason I was very much concerned about that is that it was apparent to me that it would favor schools that were stronger, had a history of tremendous amount of funding, that have a tremendous amount of leverage, and then the smaller schools would not be able to compete. So if you had a model, and the model as it was articulated at that time was school to school, then there were winners and losers. And that's not what education and educational institutions should be about in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Each educational institution should be identified, associated with its mission, and it should be striving for, and we as policymakers and enablers, so to speak, should be helping them to become excellent. Excellent. Every institution in the Commonwealth must be excellent. To do anything less seems like a little game we playing here, the winners and losers game. And I didn't think that was appropriate. Now, there are other models. There's not just the models of institutions against institutions. There are models of, I think someone suggested that you set your goals and you either work towards your goals, you achieve them or not, and maybe there's some money at the end of the pot. But still, I think that undermines and defeats this idea of excellence for every institution. That's our mindset. That's what we should be doing. That's how we should be focusing. Now, these 30 or so states that are involved in this, I don't think there's any or much evidence that they've produced excellence because they have performance-based models. So that made me think about it a little more, and I said, what's really driving this thing? And when I thought about it, I said, I know what's driving this thing. We don't come up with the money we should be coming up with for post-secondary institutions to become excellent within the context of their mission and how they're focused. And I'm thinking that we're dumbing it down when we take a model and we put it's good for people like me. I can say, hey, here's the money, you all go fight over it. But it doesn't get us where we want to go. I don't think it serves Kentucky for us to go down that route. Now, I don't say that harshly because I think that there are probably some other models that someone could investigate that I may be able to at least give some support to. But I do want to close by saying, don't get me started on this. I can talk all day.
We got to get to the House side.
I said, but don't get me started on this. We could talk all day. My point is, and what I want to make clear is, I'm open to this. I enjoyed the discussion with respect to that, but I think we better be careful. about how we not strive forward in terms of our responsibility as a legislature to provide the adequate funds for these institutions to thrive and progress, because we have found something that's interesting and cute and sounds rational, but may have an effect that's negative to what we're trying to achieve.
So we'll ask the Speaker Pro Tem why that resolution didn't get anywhere in the House.
Great question.
I
I
just
don't know.
explained.
I don't remember, but I'll tell you this: I don't mind certain moving it to a certain extent. I think performance-based funding, to a certain extent, is good. I think what I have seen coming out of our CPE and the presidents, I think is a good shift. It shifts from inputs to outputs, and we did that to a certain extent, to a great extent, and with Kentucky Education Reform Act. That's what it was all about. So I don't see, to a certain extent, that is bad. In fact, I think it's good. Now, some states like Tennessee have gone way too far, in my judgment, and they've maybe done 100% or some huge percentage toward performance-based. I think there are several different metrics that come into play and should be considered, but I don't have any problem with performance-based funding being a part of the discussion.
Representative Quarles?
I think it'd be interesting to see a pilot project of some sort, but when we talk about what we want to gain in the Commonwealth and meet our 2020 goals of reaching the national average of baccalaureate degree attainment, providing incentives might encourage better behaviors at the college campus level. But I think the bigger question coming up when we're talking about funding is what the budget's going to look like over the next biennium. And I'm sure you'll have a question about that, but I know that things are improving, but there's going to be a budget battle this next session.
As there always is. Senator Givens wanted to address this question again, and let me just sort of tee up another ball for you here. What if the House said, we're for this, but only if it's a reward pool, if it doesn't affect base funding, if it's effectively just bonus money instead of affecting the base? I see Representative Richards nodding his head. Maybe that's where the House is.
Sure.
What do you think about that idea?
Al, let me respond to that first, and then I'd like to pick on a couple of things that were said or elaborate some on a couple of thoughts. As initially written, Senate Concurrent Resolution 106 was only for new monies. We were not going to touch the base. The longer-term question relative to that base, though, is does the money you receive as a reward become part of the base?
Right.
And I feel it should not. I feel that reward pool should be what it should be there again in 2 years or 4 years for competition in a positive way to keep moving forward, not just for the students, but for the taxpayers that make that investment. Now, I want to respond to a couple of words that were used, and that revolves around what I'm confident is a question you have further down in your notes, is a funding adequacy question. Let's talk about funding adequacy for just a moment in light of surrounding states and using data that I would presume we all would agree is fairly accurate. If you pull up the SREB data for public four-year colleges and universities and take a look at this funding adequacy question. Appropriations per full-time equivalent student. This data was updated in March of 2015, so it's the most accurate data we have. Out of the 16 states in SREB region, funding as it relates to appropriations by the General Assembly or the legislature in that state per full-time equivalent student, Kentucky was 5th out of 16. So we're on the verge of being in the top quarter of the states in relation to
The
public
southern
monies.
states.
The SREB
the
states.
16 SREB states.
Southern SREB states, right. 5th out of 16. If you look at tuition and fees revenue per full-time equivalent student, Kentucky is 3rd out of 16. So funding adequacy, this seems to indicate that we're adequately funding the effort. Now, Certainly not to pick on a lot of people in this room that I have great respect for, but if you look at graduation and progression rates of full-time students, Kentucky ranks 12th out of 16 for success. So I think it's past time for us to take a look at some performance-based metrics that say when you do well, you're incentivized to keep doing better. When you don't quite get every dollar that's on the table for you to get, then you need to take a close look at why you're missing the mark. I don't think that's beyond measure.
Anybody else want to take a crack at this question?
I wanna
Go right
talk
ahead.
a little bit about that. While we're talking about statistics, since the Great Recession started in 2008, funding for post-secondary education in Kentucky has been cut by $900 million. To me, that's a travesty. And this past year, Kentucky had the largest per-student cut in the nation, $179 million, according to the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. Kentucky is just one of 3 states, Oklahoma and West Virginia being the other 2, not exactly great bastions of higher education. Those 3 have cut per-student funding in each of the past 2 years. The only 3 states in the entire country. I think we're underfunding our system tremendously. I think we're shifting the burden to the students, and we don't need to be doing that. I think we have a responsibility in 2016 to make some significant increases in higher education, and I'll be supporting that.
Well, that's a perfect segue into the next question, which is adequacy and affordability. Because the legislature has, in effect, used the availability of tuition increases to balance the budget. I'll just go right back to Representative Gibbons, since he's in the wheelhouse in the Senate. What are the prospects for any additional funding for higher education in the 2016 session?
This is going to be one of the most challenging budget sessions that we've ever faced. And if you're not aware of that, let me say it now and say it loudly. This is going to be one of the most challenging budget sessions we've ever faced. With the expansion of the Medicaid population, the pension obligations that you're continuing to hear us being one of the worst funded in the nation, on top of those very, very large things that are taking almost all the air out of the room, recently in the A&R Interim Joint Committee, we had a discussion about presumption of cancer eligibility for firefighters and incurring the cost of that, a very important conversation. The state police very appropriately and very professionally made it clear that they are one of the worst paid professional organizations in all the southern states. And they made that a very emotional point in time if you follow the news about the recent death of the trooper. So it's going to be a real challenge to find additional monies. I certainly think that if we have a performance-based model that says you put new money in, the potential for better outcomes is there, I think that turns the conversation in a positive direction.
We'll get on to the others, but I want to ask you one point, because you mentioned Medicaid. Do you not believe the state-funded study by Deloitte that says the expansion will pay for itself by generating health care jobs and tax revenue at least through the next 2-year budget?
It's fascinating, and I do not believe the Deloitte study.
Why not?
And let me share with you why, Al. Thank you for the opportunity to do that. When you take a look at a piece of legislation that we have to file in the legislature, and we send that through a scoring process, if it has a fiscal impact, we're required to get a fiscal note. Sometimes, much to the chagrin of a lot of legislators, they won't dynamically score those things. We want them to say, what's the positive economic impact in the future for the things that could potentially happen? Deloitte had the freedom in a white paper to say, potentially this expansion is going to create the need for structure that drives jobs and drives investment, and so we can...
Let me stop you. The white paper was by Price Waterhouse that made the predictions. The Deloitte study was based on the first year, which did show job growth.
And extrapolated on out.
Right.
And subtracted down from the cost that the state's going to incur And I think they're still missing the mark on the number that are going to be in the expansion, aren't they? The latest numbers
I
I've
think
heard,
the expansion essentially is filled up. It seems to have plateaued at about 400,000.
the last numbers that I had heard in the last 2 weeks was higher than that.
Well, they've enrolled 430 or so, but they have this churn, and it's basically plateaued at 400.
I'm concerned that the numbers are not real.
You mean the state's lying to you?
The state would never lie.
All right. Let me write down that quote. Now, back to higher education funding and the prospects, therefore, Senator Neal.
Let's get right down to the real issue here. Kentucky's tax structure is bad. We've sidestepped significant tax reform from the beginning. In the 90s, when money was flowing and everything we could cut, and we served everybody's interest, we cut everything we could, not thinking about the future, fiscally unsound way to proceed, cut, mindlessly. Then the 2000s came, and then we started dealing with an unstructured, or a, what do they call that? A structural deficit in terms of our the way we were setting up our budgets and so forth. 2001 came, 2008 came. Throughout the 2000s, in fact, we were always operating at a deficit. And now we're here. No substantial rainy day fund or anything to fall back on. No serious tax reform, even though we don't have a broad enough base. We're not taxing areas that perhaps should be, overtaxing areas that perhaps we should mediate or qualify in some other way. And yet we keep running around like where's this money going to come from? We're not structured. We're not structured from a tax standpoint to actually meet the future adequately, and therefore we have these continuing processes that we try to function within, and that's where our real problem is. And education is no exception to that, because there are competing dollars, as has been pointed out by Senator Givens, throughout government. We're going to continue to have that until we deal with fundamental questions of tax reform.
Well, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative to change the subject, because I agree with you completely. The state's tax structure is more than 30 years out of date, and it does need to be reformed, and the political logic tells you that the easiest time to do comprehensive tax reform is in a governor's first session. Any nods at the Republican end of the table on that? The Democrats nodded, but the Republicans didn't. So I'll ask Senator Givens and Representative Quarles if you agree with that, and what are the prospects with tax reform in this session?
When you look at the intersection of politics and policy, Al, I always think that one session we have when there is no election is the time to do vast and sweeping change, and that would be in 2017. That would give a governor a session to get his or her feet on the ground. They would have to go through the process of developing that first budget. It would be a biennial budget, a 2-year budget, and then you'd be well poised, I would think, to make the argument and cash in the political capital to make these sorts of changes.
You'd have to conserve some of that capital in your first session and lay the groundwork.
It expires quickly, so
Yeah.
don't conserve it long.
All right, Representative Quarles.
You could also see a prospect for comprehensive tax reform during a special session, where the governor can restrict the conversation and restrict the topics which the General Assembly may deliberate on. And I think that there's been more than enough studies done. I think we've had 10 tax reform studies in a period of 20 years, but there's always been political barriers, I guess you could say, to find common ground. But I think that it might be a situation where a special session where the Pope just visited the United States. When they choose a pope, they close the doors. They don't come out until they have a solution. So,
All right, let's ask the longest tenured member of this panel what he thinks about the prospects.
Most
of tax
every
reform.
candidate for governor that I can remember has proposed a tax restructure,
Including you, right?
including me. If I'd have won, we would have been doing that. However, and I do think that the first session when a governor's there is when he or she has the most clout, and perhaps that would be the best time, although Senator Givens certainly makes a good point. All 138 of us think that we need tax reform. There are 138 different views on how that would look. And so there's just, I have not seen in these years any consensus on how that would look. Now, some people on the other side of the aisle have a certain view. Some of us have other views. I think the governor's going to have to lead on this, come with a proposal, whether it's in a regular session or special session, and it does need to be done.
Senator Neal?
I think Representative Quarles has a good idea there. Get everybody in the room, let's get it done, and the ideologues need to set their ideology aside for a while and do what's right for Kentucky. You got these guys say cut, cut, cut. You got somebody else saying spend, spend, spend. No, that's not what the discussion should be. It should be what is right for Kentucky. What model can we develop that would carry Kentucky forward, and that includes post-secondary education.
Well, since you mentioned ideologues, which for some Democrats is code word for Republicans, I have to ask you, the fundamental argument of Republicans is we need to move toward less of an income-based tax system and more of a consumption-based tax system. What is your view on that?
Well, from a consumption-based tax system is regressive. I mean, $20,000, let's just put it this way. Let's say $8,000 out of a budget of someone making $25,000 is different from $8,000 out of a budget of someone making $1 million. So when you start talking about consumption-based, and there are fundamentals, there's a break point where, this is what you survive on.
Of course, it depends on what exemptions you might build into that.
Well, that's what I'm just saying. Well, that's true. I didn't just say that. There are exemptions that you could build into that particular model, so I can't speculate on how that would play. But generally speaking, I would say it's a regressive approach.
This is about as broad a subject as you could ask about, so I'll just ask the panel if anybody else has anything else to add on tax reform.
A brief
The
thought.
pain of an unexpressed thought.
A brief thought, Al. We always talk about tax modernization, i.e. revenue modernization. I think if you're going to have a really frank conversation, it has to be a spending and revenue modernization conversation. So not just the revenue side, but the appropriation side as well.
The Democrats would probably say, hey, we've cut the budget 13 times in the Beshear administration. Have we not effectively been forced to reform spending by the economic situation?
The question is the effectiveness of outcomes. It's more an effectiveness of outcomes
And how you measure them.
and how you measure them.
Okay.
Well, that's
All right.
more than that.
It's 5 o'clock, and I said we would try to reserve the last half hour for questions from the audience. And I rarely moderate a panel before an audience that is as qualified to ask questions as this one, whether you've had your board training or not. So please think of a good question to ask these policymakers. These are the people who will be deciding the policy and budget of your institutions in the next few years, and this is a really good opportunity to ask them a tough question. Who'll be first? Okay, we can start with an easy one, but somebody be first. Yes. Stand up so that people can hear you. She's bringing a mic. Just wait for the mic.
Thank you all so much for coming. My name is J. Todd Ritchie, and I'm the student regent on the Western Kentucky University Board of Regents. And I believe I speak for the Board of Student Body Presidents as well as all students in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. When we look at the decline of state appropriations for higher education for the past few decades, many students ask, are we just going to get to a point where we privatize higher education? Is that so? And if not, why should students believe otherwise?
Okay, who wants to take a crack at that one?
Senator Gibbons.
Go Tops.
Let me. You've already heard, J. Todd, you've heard my view on it. I think that, and you and I have talked about it also, I think that certainly it's going to be a tough session. They're all tough. But we have to have a will. I want to inject that word. We have to have a will to raise the amount of money, the appropriation for higher education. Yes, That may mean cuts in other places, but I really believe that we have extended the students in the state about as far as we can extend them, and I certainly favor whatever adjustments need to be made to try to give our universities some aid and give some relief to our students.
From the Republican ends, anyway?
Thanks for your comment. I'm one of 3 legislators that went through CARA reform, and I was served on the board of student body presidents, and certainly can empathize with your perspective. But there's an inverse relationship between state funding and tuition raises, and I think that when I started in the fall of '02, tuition rates have doubled or tripled since then. There's over $1.4 trillion in student loan debt in America right now, which is more than the amount of credit card debt held by Americans. And although we're going through a tough budgetary time, it might be an opportunity to give our universities some flexibility to operate financially a little more independently, particularly through the innovations of P3 legislation, which we've struggled to continue to get out of the legislature, but we've seen at the University of Kentucky and elsewhere that when you have some creative financing, you can keep on building, keep on moving. And so it might be a time to have more higher ed emphasis on a potential P3 legislation. But
Well, it seems
student
like
loan debt, just to finish that thought, has become a generational issue. The millennials have delayed being able to have a mortgage. It has delayed when our generation gets married and make other financial decisions, and it's something that a lot of people start off life crippled in debt. I don't know what the solution is, but it's somewhat unsustainable at this point.
That's good perspective. I wanted to ask, what more do universities really need? Because I think Western, if I'm not mistaken, was the first university to institute essentially privatized dorms. UK has now jumped into that big time. What specifically more authority would universities need to be more flexible financially?
I'm here to learn.
Okay. Next question. Yes, Mayor Miller. Wait for the mic.
I'm concerned about financial aid for the neediest students. Students across the board get Keys scholarships, and that serves them very well. But the lower income people need CAP money. And from what I understand, the CAP money that is supposed to come from the lottery is swept out of the financial aid bucket and put into the general fund, leaving the low-income students with very little chance of getting the money that the legislature originally planned for them to have. And I guess the CAP money runs out in something like February now, when students keep applying all the way through June. So that's my question. Do we have a chance of getting the lottery money to stay in the fund that's supposed to help the CAP?
Mayor, apparently, approximately $30 million was swept from the lottery money. I fought hard and not to have that swept, because I think that the lottery was sold on money for students, for education.
Is being sold. I mean, they're even running ads.
Yeah,
now
oh
to
yeah,
say that.
it is. And that at the time that $30 million was taken out, there wasn't much comment in the press or media or public at all. But it was something that we don't need to be doing. That $30 million would have gone a long way in CAP and KTG.
We need to correct that, pure and simple.
Others?
I'll jump in on that, Al. And I'm actually going to try 2 birds with 1 stone. I'd like to go back to Mr. Ritchie's question because it was a good one. The conversation about declining state funding. If you take a look at the chart that the LRC provides us, I know it's hard to see from back in the back of the room, but basically it's not declining state funding. It's flat, basically just flat state funding over a long period of time when costs are increasing. So as a percentage, it looks substantially lower because the costs are accumulating as inflation accumulates and time passes. The second thought I'll make with regard to that question of declining state funding as a percentage, and so always predicated as a percentage. Capital construction costs are something that often are not taken into the information that's provided by CPE, and we constantly have quality institutions coming to us in the budget process asking us to not only give them agency funding opportunities, but general fund serviced debt, and that has increased over the years. So take into account in a broader conversation that we are providing more and more capital construction cost coming directly out of the general fund to help build buildings on these campuses. The third thought that I'll provide to you is tied into your question. Over the course of time, the KEYS money has gone up considerably, and that money flows directly back to our state institutions. So there is money flowing, although it's flowing through a different source, there is some money flowing that was not flowing to these state institutions years ago. Respecting the budget process, we commit ourselves to funding KEYS fully. And that's what we've done. To my knowledge, historically, we've always funded the KEYS component. The CAP and KTG, it's there to battle over what's left out of that Kentucky higher ed funds. Sadly enough, it is. I was proud on the Senate side when the budget came to us a year and a half ago, we increased the CAP and KTG funds above what the governor and the House had said should be in that budget. It was one of the few things they let us keep. When we went into negotiations, they let us keep our higher number in that case. But certainly CAP and KTG deserve another look.
Question on capital construction. Clarify for me, you said that the legislature has provided capital construction money, but in recent years, the legislature made it easier for universities to use agency money, didn't it? So there's really less of a demand on the legislature for capital construction money these days. Am I wrong about that?
I have the exact numbers in all the papers up here, but I'm not going to flip through them. I'll share with you that 2008, my understanding is there was a substantial amount of general fund supported debt in that budget. 2010, the budget was agency bonds only with no general fund supported debt. 12, I think, was the same way, but we came back in 14 with a substantial amount of general fund supported debt in that budget for universities.
And I know that some universities are planning to ask for more in 16, so hold on to your hats. Question in the back. Wait for the mic.
Wayne Andrews at Morehead State University. Thank you all for participating in this discussion. I think it's interesting. I'm finishing my 11th year as president of Morehead State University, have really enjoyed my time there, and I think as an institution we're making significant progress for the students that we're charged with supporting, students and families. But here's the situation that we face, and all of the institutions face this. In 1997, when higher ed reform was passed, we looked at the data at that point in history, what it costs per FTE student to educate a person. And if you fast forward that through, I think it was 2013, the last data that the CPE put together for us, for lawmakers, for everybody, and you look at the total public funds, that is the dollars, state general fund appropriation and tuition per FTE student across that time, what you actually see is the cost of an education went down, not up. It went down. CPE data. Bob King sitting over here, he can verify that for us. What's happened, though, is the shift in who's paying for the cost of the education. So in higher ed reform, it was more on the part of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Today it's more on the backs of students. And so reflecting on the question asked by the student leadership here, you know, what, are we going to privatize this deal after a while or what? It's a very legitimate question. Now to Senator Givens and Senator Neal and Senator Representative Richards, I'm sorry. You know, there's a lot of debate about performance funding, and we appreciate that. The presidents have all basically said we're supportive of performance funding. The devil's in the details. It's a matter of working it out so it's an appropriate thing. But here's what I would want to. My question's around this part of it. So what we've seen in my 11 years, we've seen a decline in state general fund appropriation. We've seen the elimination of maintenance and operating money on all new buildings. So we've added at Moorhead, for example, 250,000 square feet of new buildings. We received no maintenance and operating money for that in the last 3 biennial budgets. No capital construction money. Significant increases in the cost of retirement contributions, significant increases in the cost of medical insurance for our personnel. It's as if, when I listen to this discussion, that if we dangle a carrot out here, we're just going to be so much more excited to do something because we can get a few extra dollars. That's nonsense. We are highly motivated on our campuses to see all of our students graduate, but we've got some significant challenges, some financial and some based on the students that come to us. So does this kind of thinking stir any emotion on your part? I'd be interested to hear what you all have to say about it.
It stirs emotion on my part. You're making my argument.
Let's get a response from Senator Givens.
President Andrews, thank you for your leadership at Moorhead, and thank you for the miles that Moorhead is helping our students and our future taxpayers travel. I applaud you and all the leaders in the room for dealing with challenging financial times. But let's not kid ourselves. We could go into any association in the state related to any industry group, be it healthcare, be it law enforcement, be whatever it may be, and from 2008 through this point in time, they've all faced financial challenges. That's the reality of the challenge that we faced as a state and as a nation. The downturn has been real. Now, the question earlier related to tax modernization, I have the luxury of saying, if I had been here, because I was elected in 2008 and began serving in 2009. The first 4 sessions were budget sessions for me. And until this most recent budget, there was never any new revenue to spend anywhere. It was amazing to go in and have a little bit of money to look at trying to allocate to people. So I say that to say, don't take wrong the fact that I'm anxious about performance-based funding. I realize institutions have faced real challenges. I applaud you for your leadership, but I remain committed to us spending the taxpayer dollar as wisely as we can. Now, when we have the kind of performance metrics that I laid out for you with regard to degree productivity and degree attainment and graduation rates, we're not excelling as a state compared to our surrounding states. Can we do better? Yes, we can. Will the leadership in this room help us do better? I'm confident it will. But we still got miles to travel in outcomes as well as funding.
Representative?
My point, Dr. Andrews, was that I thought that a certain amount of performance funding is fine, but there is no question that we need to allocate more money in the base of our institutions. And I'm willing to try to do that. It won't be easy. It never is easy. But you have to prioritize, in my judgment, what is really important for the state. And I think education is the most important function of state government, from pre-K through the university level. So I'm willing to try my very best to try to find some better funding for our higher education institutions. Now, that's my promise.
If any of my UK colleagues are in the room, they know that we've been wrestling with a whole new budget model at the university and still don't have it, but we are, I think most colleges are moving toward rewards for better student retention, better graduation rates, and so on. Senator Neal, why shouldn't that be part of the equation for state funding overall?
Well, I didn't say it shouldn't be.
How should we implement those things?
Well, I'm saying I'm open to the discussion, and I think something that's appropriately structured, everything's on the table. It's just that my discussion goes beyond that. My discussion is much more fundamental than that. It gets to the fact that we have kicked the can down the road year after year on restructuring our tax situation, and we're paying for it. And there is an environment out there that is militated against us. mentioned that 2008 is iconic of all of that. But the fact of the matter is that we can play games with this, and we can be Republican and Democrat, and I'm leader and you're not leader, and you can come in here and whine about, I shouldn't say whine, but they'll whine about what you don't have, and I don't mean that derisively, because it's real. You don't have it. Because we're not taking as policymakers the steps that should be taken to enable us to prepare and lay a firm foundation to go into the future with. That is the fundamental issue in this room, as far as I can tell.
Next question.
Al, let me interject if I can,
sure.
and I want to do it respectfully because this is certainly not a debate. But Speaker Richards makes a point that I think is something that I should speak to, and I could come in the room, President Andrews, I could come in the room and tell you exactly what you want to hear. I could come in the room and tell you that post-secondary funding is the number one priority for me in this upcoming budget. But that would be insulting to K-12 teachers who are questioning whether their pensions are going to be funded or not. That would be insulting to the state police who are wanting bulletproof glass on the front of cruisers. So I'm not going to come in the room and tell you that. I respect you enough to have an honest conversation with you.
Okay. Question here.
I'm Bob Statt. I'm the faculty rep on CPE, and I've heard three times excellence from our universities, that sort of thing. It does take excellent professors, and we have many of them, and they are here because they really love the state, love to teach. But at the same time, we have a difficult time recruiting in the top-notch researchers, professors, as well as retaining them. And from that perspective, the Bucks for Brains, or the Research Challenge Trust, was very successful at bringing in people. The return on investment to the state has been very good, and it's more of a statement than a question, but if anyone would like to comment on it. Fine.
Well, I had it on my list of questions, but I thought I had a conflict of interest because I'm partly funded by Bucks for Brains. So who wants to take a crack at that one?
I was in 1997, and higher education reform was when we started Bucks for Brains. I thought it was a wonderful program. A few years after that, there was a reception in Frankfurt for the Bucks for Brains professors, and I was just amazed by the quality of folks that we had drawn to Kentucky. And I am very pleased that there is an allocation for Bucks for Brains in this proposal this year that we will be considering, and I certainly favor it.
Anyone else? President Ransdell. Wait for the mic.
Bob, I appreciate that comment because I would say that a top priority for us, and I expect most institutions, is faculty and staff compensation. And when typically there is money for salaries, public school teachers are typically included along with state employees, but our faculty and staff are not included. So that leads to and I appreciate Speaker Pro Tem Richards' priorities and what he has stated. But my question would be, if tax reform occurs and if there are other revenue streams that are identified and passed through whatever appropriate legislation, where will higher education be in the priority for that revenue?
That's a pretty good question. Representative Quarles, you want to take a crack at that?
Well, of course, it's number one.
He is running for something this year.
I told him just a moment ago. I told him just a moment ago. I said it sure is a good thing I'm not running for statewide office. The way I'm answering all these questions, and listen to him.
You've already heard my view, and so it doesn't need to be repeated. The only concern that I have is don't hold your breath on tax reform. I'm for it. I think it needs to be done, but there are so many different views on how it would be done. I'm concerned that it will be a long time before we do it.
Don't hold your breath, but I'm going to tell you, press on,
Yeah.
because it has to happen.
It does.
We will lag behind.
If you know that we would be a funding priority with whatever we would get behind.
Well, I think it's clear you're a funding priority based on the statements that I've already made. But my point is, we can sit up here and talk about that all the time. Yeah, you number one, you're at the top of the heap. But if we don't do those things that are necessary to bring that about, we're not talking. This is an empty discussion. And the question here, like all discussions, is will this be an empty discussion? Are we going to press for that or just settle for what we have? And I think we ought to challenge, and I do it all the time, we ought to challenge our leaders, us, me included, as well as the House, and we should go for it, even if we fail. You cannot, well, I could go on with that. I'll just leave it that way. Yes, it's one of the highest priorities. There are other great priorities, you know that. But it's the highest priority. But if we don't change our fundamental way of doing business, we're going to have some serious, serious problems projected on into the future.
Senator Givens and then Representative Quarles.
I'll be brief, Al, but I want, President Ranswell, your question prompts me to share a brief glimpse inside the budget process that probably a lot of you are not aware that we struggle through on the Senate side and the House struggles through as well, and then we end up where we end up, which is late at night, long hours. We got the budget on the Senate side with some changes the governor proposed, some changes the House proposed, and then the capital construction projects that all the universities said that they wanted, and certainly, very appropriately, a lot of those still are in flux and play. When we received that request for funding from the House in a bill form and took a look at it, the question we faced on the Senate side is, what do these institutions really want? And some were coming to us and saying, take our capital construction money out and give us operational funding. Give us a 2% increase in our base. And no capital construction money. Others were saying, we'd like the 1%. We'd like a little bit of capital construction money here. Others were saying, take out all of the operations increase in the base and give us all capital construction money. And Gary, we sat down and actually worked through a spreadsheet that had everyone's top priority, and you start adding up dollars and looking at who's getting what, and suddenly everything gets skewed because your debt service for 20 years versus operational costs for 1 year. So I share that with you to say, you said come to us with a unified voice. If you could find a way to come to us with a unified voice, I think it makes policy a lot better and politics a lot less.
Representative Quarles.
All joking aside, I would argue the biggest export the United States has is higher education. And that's a strategic asset our country has. We can argue about where we're at in the rankings worldwide, but people are coming here to study. And that's something we got to protect. And one of the ways you can, this is a piece of advice I have, is to get to know your legislators. How many of you here, raise a hand, have had a direct conversation with either your House or Senate legislator since session ended back in April? Most of the crowd. I would encourage you.
About half.
About half. You should be the speaker. You're pretty good at seeing when the line's drawn. But
I estimated crowds for a long time.
But my advice is this: get to know your legislator on a personal basis, especially as you serve in your capacity as a trustee or a regent, because when we'll have over 1,000 bills filed within a 60-day session starting in January, and they range from all over the place. They're all competing over the same resources. But if you have a direct connection with your legislator, and when that budget is being hammered out by leadership within the last 2 weeks, it's important that you have a direct line of communications with the person who's going to be voting on that budget up or down. And so that's a piece of advice I give, because legislators were expected to know a little bit about everything, but it's hard to us to be an expert on every topic. So don't make the assumption that we know exactly what you're talking about.
That's good advice. Now, the old Professor Richards has a little history lesson for us.
On November 3rd, we will elect a new governor. 5 weeks later, that governor will be inaugurated. In about a month after that, 138 yahoos come to town. And 15 days after that, the new governor has to present us a balanced budget. Now, you talk about a sprint for a new governor. It's a real challenge. Then the House wrestles with the budget for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and then sends it to the Senate. And they never use enough wisdom to choose to just take our budget as we send it.
You've never given us enough time.
So
choose
they changed it around a little bit, and then we form a committee and wrestle with it way into the wee hours of the morning, and come up with generally a pretty good budget. But I go through that to tell you, first of all, what a challenge a new governor has. And so we need to work, I agree with Representative Quarles, you need to work with whomever the new governor is and work with us to make sure that we get your priorities. And again, I think, I certainly think we need to do better by our institutions in 2016.
Well, thank you all very much. We have run out of time for the panel, but I'm sure there will be plenty of opportunities for people to engage in those good one-on-one conversations that Representative Quarles talked about. Thank you very much for your attention and attendance.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you, Al.
Well, I don't look at you as yahoos. In fact, I look at you as the state's fiduciaries, the state's board of directors. And I would ask only this, listening to this spirited discussion, for which we thank you. As you know, I served in a state legislature in another state for a number of years and went on to be budget director in that state. And I have to tell you that I always thought of higher education as just another expenditure, one of the thousands of expenditures that state governments have to deal with and state legislators have to deal with and prioritize. But I've come to see, and I admit my bias, obviously, that in listening to the governor this afternoon at lunch, and I've heard him repeatedly say that the single most important thing that employers are looking for when they make decisions about whether to build a facility and hire people in Kentucky or to stay in Kentucky is whether or not we have the workforce to meet their needs. The workforce of the 21st century is no longer going to be satisfied with people who have only completed high school. And we know from all the data, increasing numbers of Kentuckians, in order to be employable, are going to need the kinds of education that are delivered at our community and technical colleges and at our baccalaureate institutions. So as we think about this, and as you think about this, I would ask you, instead of considering higher education as just another expenditure, it really is an investment in the future of this state, an investment that will pay dividends not only in improving the quality of our workforce and the employability of our people, but we also know, and we'll talk about this tomorrow, it improves the health of our citizens. It reduces the likelihood that they will need the social services that government spends so much money on, whether it's Medicaid or it's aid to families with dependent children, or what we call those programs today. It reduces the likelihood that they will be incarcerated. So of all of the things that state government spends money on, I really would hope as you have these discussions, and I know how difficult they will be, that what these people work on every day and are committed to is something that really needs to be thought of in different terms as you go forward and make a budget for the state of Kentucky.